In the year 1692, the citizens of Salem, Massachusetts went on a witch hunt. Before it was over, 200 people were accused of being witches, and 20 of those accused were executed. This bizarre episode in American history left such an impression that the term witch trial has been used as a synonym for injustice to this very day. We've all heard the stories, but how much of what we know is really true? Today we're going to debunk some misconceptions and falsehoods about the Salem witch trials. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. And while you're at it, if you would be so kind, please leave a comment and let us know what topics you would like to hear about. Okay, let's see if you're a witch or not. In the years just prior to the witch trials, Salem had been overrun with refugees fleeing a war between England and France that was raging to the north. Resources were strained, putting the locals in competition with both the newcomers and each other. Pre-existing local political conflicts over everything from church privileges to grazing rights to property lines began to intensify. As things got worse, people began to suspect the discord was the work of the devil. Nine-year-old Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, respectively the daughter and niece of the local Reverend Samuel Parris, started having fits. A doctor diagnosed the condition as the result of witchcraft. Under pressure by the adults, Elizabeth and Abigail placed the blame on three women: a local beggar named Sarah Good, an impoverished old lady named Sarah Osborne, and a slave named Tituba. This case, which remains famous, may be one of the reasons why many people assume that the victims of the Salem witch trials were exclusively women. However, while the accused were mostly women, records show that about a quarter of them were men. In fact, a full 30% of those convicted and executed during the Salem witch trials were men. These men could be targeted for any number of reasons, from being related to a woman accused of practicing witchcraft to being friends with the wrong tribe of American Indians. It was hard to tell what might get one accused, but one thing was clear: being a man did not necessarily make you safe. In 1953, Arthur Miller, one of the most famous American playwrights of all time, turned the story of the Parris family into the play The Crucible. The Crucible used the events of Salem Colony as an allegory for the communist hunts being led at the time by Senator Joe McCarthy of the House of Representatives Committee on Un-American Activities. The Crucible became massively successful and went on to be adapted into television shows, movies, and even an opera. While Miller's play has reinforced the popular image of young women being accused of witchcraft, the truth is much more complicated. Older women were, in fact, just as likely to have the finger pointed at them as young women. This was especially true when those older women were widows who had no male heirs and owned vast swaths of land. Once their husbands were lost, those women, who were valued mostly in terms of their ability to have and raise male children, were highly vulnerable to charges of witchcraft. If there's one constant throughout history, it's that impoverished people have it rough. That's probably why most people assume that the accused were all poor and downtrodden, but that's not the case. Believe it or not, quite the opposite. To fully understand what happened, you first need to understand that there were actually two Salems: Salem Town and Salem Village. Salem Town was a prosperous port, mostly populated by well-to-do merchants. Salem Village, on the other hand, was a farming area, and its residents tended to be on the poorer and more puritanical side. When it came to the witch trials, most of the accusers came from the impoverished village, and most of the accused came from the wealthy town. This has led scholars to speculate that the unequal distribution of wealth may have played a major role in motivating and perpetrating the trials. However, it's interesting to note that the villagers themselves didn't always agree on everything, and the trials were no exception. Those who supported the trials tended to live further from the port. Those who lived closer to the port tended to oppose them. Exacerbating this division was the controversial Reverend Parris himself. As a staunchly puritanical anti-wealth minister, the Reverend and his flock purposefully fueled the hysteria that kept the trials going. Villagers who opposed the trials made efforts to have the Reverend fired and replaced, but they were countered by his flock. While Reverend Parris wasn't unusual for a religious leader of his time, neither was he completely representative. Almost immediately after the first hangings, the widely known and respected minister Cotton Mather wrote a letter to the court begging them not to admit what was then called spectral evidence, that is, evidence known through supernatural dreams and visions. Mather's son, then president of Harvard, agreed, writing that it would be better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person to be condemned. This plea moved the governor of the colony to halt arrests, while he established a new court that wouldn't hear spectral evidence. This new court condemned only 3 of the next 56 defendants. The governor pardoned all of those accused of witchcraft. Well, all of those who hadn't already been executed, at least. As previously established, 70% of those executed during the witch trials were women and 30% were men, but those were just the human victims. That's right, if you thought trying and condemning human beings was going to be enough crazy for the people of Salem Village, then brace yourself. The paranoia was so out of control that at least 2 dogs that we know of were executed. Yes, you heard that right, dogs. Not sure how they defended themselves in court, but yeah. One of the dogs was accused by a young girl of attempting to bewitch her, which, if you look at my dog's eyes, she is always trying to guilt you into giving you some of your sandwich. The other dog was charged with being under the control of a witch. The name Salem has been virtually synonymous with witch hunt, so one could be forgiven for thinking those trials were the first and only ones of their kind. But in all fairness to the people of Salem Village, the idea of accusing innocent people of witchcraft goes way, way back before their time. Europe had been dabbling in witch trials for over 3 centuries. England passed laws that made the practice of witchcraft and anything related to it illegal. A book called Malleus Maleficarum, which contains instructions on how to identify a witch, became all the rage. Professional witch hunters sprang up everywhere. It got bad. How bad? Well, whereas the events in Salem lasted a year and claimed 20 lives, some of the European witch trials lasted 10 times as long and took the lives of thousands. 50,000 such witches are thought to have been sentenced in Europe between the 16th and 17th century alone. Not only weren't the Salem witch trials the first witch hunts, they're actually more noteworthy for being among the last. While several witch hunts occurred in North America prior to Salem, no one had actually been put to death for being a witch in nearly 30 years. In Europe, the philosophical age that would come to be known as the Enlightenment, which placed reason and knowledge above superstition, was dawning. Its influence helped bring an end to the practice of witch trials. By the time of Salem, people had assumed such things were in the past, which just made the event more shocking and more memorable. The trope of a crowd of angry villagers calling for a witch to be burned is a common one in fiction. Indeed, the aforementioned European witch trials did use burning as a method of execution. However, things were done a bit differently in Salem. The victims of the trials of 1892 and 93 almost exclusively met their fate through hanging. The one known exception to this was an 80-year-old man named Giles Corey. Because he wouldn't plead guilty, he was pressed to death between 2 heavy stones. Not a pretty thought, but nonetheless, not a single victim of the Salem trials were burned. Today, most people don't believe in witchcraft. So when it comes to what happened in Salem, most people assume that the villagers who claim to be experiencing supernatural fits had to be faking it. This may well be the case. However, there is another possibility. Ergot infected grain. Ergot is a fungus that infects rye, a crop that was heavily used by the Salem population. Ingesting ergot can cause hallucinations similar to those caused by taking LSD. Thus, it is entirely plausible that the initial fits and hallucinations that kicked off all the paranoia were real. Of course, the deadly hysteria that followed can't be blamed on the grain, but it's worth considering that the whole affair may have been kicked off by a medical misunderstanding. In the centuries since the trials, a piece of land called Gallows Hill was thought to be the site of the executions. However, in 2016, a team of researchers set out to find the exact spot of the hangings and discovered that everyone had been wrong all along. Buried in 1,000 pages of testimony, the group found the words of an accused witch named Rebecca Eames. Eames made an offhanded remark about witnessing the executions at the house below the hill. Checking this reference against old maps, court records, and historical sources, the team determined that the executions were actually held on a nearby site now called Proctor's Ledge. Today, this area sits beside a Walgreens parking lot. In 2017, the city created a memorial to the victims of the witch trials on the site. By January of 1697, the trials were considered a tragedy, and a court-ordered day of fasting and contemplation was observed in the colony. 5 years later, the trials were officially declared unlawful. 9 years after that, the convicted were all officially exonerated and restitution was paid to their heirs. 250 years after that, the state of Massachusetts would officially apologize. Hey, better late than never, right? But why did it happen in the first place? When something as disturbing as the Salem witch trial occurs, people go in search of answers. Surely there must be a tangible, identifiable reason these people acted this way. Fortunately, nothing could be further from the truth. Hundreds of explanations have been proposed, but none are universally agreed on. The hysteria that gripped Salem was centuries old and was born at the nexus of dozens of individual social problems. Religious beliefs played a role, but so did economics, class differences, history, migration, local politics, sexism, misogyny, and greed. We may not have actual literal witch trials anymore, but all of those problems still exist in modern society, which is just one of the reasons it's important we understand what really did and didn't happen during the Salem witch trials. Do you think something like the Salem witch trials could happen again? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, if you like creepy true stories about witches, ghosts, and the paranormal, check out some of these videos from our sister site, Graveyard Shift.